What if your death became more powerful than your life? What if your agony echoed through centuries, not as defeat, but as a battle cry? It is August 23rd, 1305. London awakens not with prayers or peace, but with hunger. A hunger for blood, for the spectacle of a man being broken so completely that no trace of him will remain. The crowd surges like a tide pressing into the cobblestone streets, not to witness justice, but to watch it die. And then they see him, dragged behind a horse through the filth and stone. His body naked, torn, and bleeding is a man they call a traitor. But in Scotland he is something far more dangerous, a symbol. His name is William Wallace, the warrior who once stood against the most powerful empire in Europe, now delivered to the executioner's stage like meat to a butcher. But what they don't know is this. Wallace's story doesn't end with ropes and fire. It begins here, in blood, in silence, in defiance, because when a man refuses to bow even in death, he becomes something England never meant to create. He becomes immortal. The streets of London have never been quieter, not because the city is empty, but because its heart is gathered in one place, watching, waiting, holding its breath for the moment a man will be torn apart for daring to dream of freedom. William Wallace is bound to a wooden hurdle stripped of all dignity. No armor, no sword, no banners flying in his name, only chains, blood, and the stench of sweat and iron. As the horse jerks forward, the sledge scrapes over stone, dragging Wallace's broken body through the mud and filth of the capital that wants him forgotten. But there is a problem. William Wallace refuses to die quietly. Each jolt rips open flesh already raw from imprisonment. His skin peels away like paper in the rain. Bones bruise, muscle tears. Still he does not scream. He does not beg. He endures. Because this is not just punishment. It's theater, a public warning. King Edward I wants the world to see what happens to anyone who resists the English crown. He doesn't want a corpse, he wants a message. But what he doesn't understand is this pain cannot erase principle, and blood only waters the roots of rebellion. The crowd lines the route like spectators at a parade. Some throw rotten fruit, others cheer. A very few watch in silence, their faces pale. Maybe they see what Edward cannot. Maybe they recognize the power of a man who, even when crushed, refuses to bow. As the sledge reaches Smithfield, the execution ground, priests turn away. Even executioners hesitate. Wallace is unrecognizable. His face, battered jaw, slack ribs pushing against bruised skin. But his eyes remain. They burn, not with hatred, not with fear, but with something England cannot kill, conviction. And that is what terrifies them most. This moment is meant to break him, to strip away every shred of dignity and hope. But instead, it sanctifies him. The mud becomes holy, the ropes relics. Wallace is no longer just a man. He is a mirror reflecting every silent hope, every crushed rebellion, every soul who dares to defy power. And as the fire crackles and the axe waits, history leans in not to mourn, but to remember, because something eternal is about to be born. Long before the crowd chanted for his death, before the gallows were built and the ropes soaked in blood, William Wallace was just a boy, not a warrior, not a symbol, just a child born beneath the wide gray skies of Renfrew, Scotland, where the wind spoke in whispers and the land still dreamed of peace. He was born around 1270 into a world that had not yet turned cruel. His father, Sir Malcolm Wallace, was a minor landowner, respected but far from royalty. Their days were filled with quiet labor, tending fields, and praying for strong harvests. They did not seek power, they sought to survive. But fate doesn't care what a man seeks. From the beginning, William was different. Not only in strength, though, by his 20s, he stood a towering 6 feet 6 inches, with shoulders broad enough to carry steel and sorrow alike, but in spirit. Where other boys chased deer, Wallace chased meaning. He studied Latin with monks devoured books most men of his station never touched. He was raised on scripture, but he heard something else between the lines. A calling. a fire. Scotland in those early years was quiet. King Alexander III ruled with wisdom and strength. Markets buzzed, fields were green, children slept without fear. But peace, like all beautiful things, is fragile. In 1286, the king died, his horse slipping in the dark near Kinghorn. With him fell the crown, and with the crown, the country. What followed was not war, but something worse. Silence, confusion, and foreign whispers slipping through the cracks. The throne passed to Margaret the Maid of Norway, a child of 3 who had never set foot on Scottish soil. She died before she could wear the crown. And in that vacuum of power, England moved. Enter Edward Longshanks. The English king was no fool. He offered help, arbitration, order. But his fingers were already tightening around Scotland's throat. He chose a puppet king, John Balliol, demanded fealty from every noble, sent English judges to settle Scottish disputes, stripped power, land, and pride from every corner of the realm. Wallace watched it all, quietly. As others bowed, he learned. As others obeyed, he remembered. Every humiliation was a stone placed in his heart. Every act of subjugation, a strike against the man he was becoming. And though he said little in those early days, something inside him was building layer by layer like a sword, being forged in silence. They thought he was just a farmer's son, but what they were really raising was a storm. Every great rebellion begins with a slow, quiet erosion of dignity, of hope, of identity. And by the 1290s, Scotland was bleeding from 1,000 such wounds. What was once a proud, independent kingdom had become something else, a province in disguise. A nation on its knees, held there by velvet chains and iron threats. Edward I of England, called Longshanks for his towering height, had offered himself as a friend, as a neutral judge in Scotland's hour of need. But he came not with balance. He came with appetite, and no one was ready for how fast he would bite. He selected John Balliol, a timid, uncertain noble, to wear the Scottish crown. But it was not a coronation. It was a leash. Balliol was king in name, but every decision, every judgment, every royal decree had to pass through Edward's hands first. When Scottish nobles gathered, they did so under English banners. When laws were passed, they echoed from English courts. The humiliation was complete. And still Wallace watched. But what snapped was not pride, it was blood. In 1296, Edward unleashed his army on Berwick-upon-Tweed, a thriving border town filled with Scottish merchants and their families. What followed wasn't war, it was annihilation. 17,000 souls perished in a single day. Men were cut down in the streets. Women were raped in front of their children. Infants were torn from their mothers' arms and flung against walls like trash. Eyewitnesses wrote of rivers running red, of silence so complete that even birds refused to sing. This is the scar that shaped William Wallace. Because you can only watch your people butchered for so long before something inside you begins to burn. And when it does, there's no putting it out. And yet, he waited. He watched Scottish nobles sign the ragman roll, pledging allegiance to Edward like conquered dogs. He watched as English lords parceled out Scottish land as rewards, and all the while, the fire inside him grew darker, hotter, sharper. It wasn't time yet. Because true rebellion isn't sparked by emotion, it's kindled by memory. By the quiet collection of every injustice, every scream, every betrayal, until your soul becomes a blade. And when Wallace finally drew that blade, he wouldn't do it for glory, or vengeance, or gold. He would do it for something far more dangerous. He would do it for freedom. History rarely turns on grand speeches or royal decrees. Sometimes it pivots on something quiet, personal, a single wound that refuses to close. For William Wallace, that moment came in May of 1297, and no one saw it coming. Some say it was the murder of Marion Braidfute, the woman he loved, killed by English soldiers. Others claim it was a final insult, an English sheriff dragging a fellow Scot through the streets like an animal. Maybe it was both. maybe it doesn't matter. What matters is this. Wallace finally broke the silence. He didn't write a letter. He didn't send an envoy. He picked up a sword and used it. The English sheriff of Lanark, William Heselrigg, didn't even have time to scream. By the time his men realized what was happening, they were already bleeding in the dirt, their bodies split open by a man they had dismissed as a ghost. The act sent shockwaves through the occupied nation. For the first time, someone had drawn English blood and lived, and suddenly the myth of English invincibility began to crack. Farmers disappeared from their fields, blacksmiths abandoned their forges. From forests, hillsides, and fishing villages, men came quietly at first, then in waves, not for coin, not even for revenge, but because they were waiting for someone to go first. Wallace was no king. He had no noble title, no bloodline of power, but he had something far more dangerous belief. He believed that freedom didn't require permission, that a man didn't need royal approval to defend his home, that justice wasn't granted, it was taken. And he had something else, something most rebels lacked: a mind for war. Wallace was no wild barbarian. He understood terrain-leveraged discipline. He trained his men not to fight for glory, but to win. Every raid was surgical, every ambush calculated. English garrisons burned before they even knew they were being hunted. Bridges collapsed, supply lines vanished, fear spread like wildfire. But it wasn't just tactics, it was the message. When Wallace spoke, his voice wasn't elegant, it was electric. We fight not for riches, not for glory. We fight for freedom alone, which no good man surrenders but with his life. Those words didn't inspire loyalty. They lit fuses. And now the English crown wasn't facing rebellion, it was facing wildfire. Because Wallace didn't just start a war, he made resistance contagious. Autumn 1297. The fields near Stirling are soaked with mist and silence. On one side of the river Forth, an army of 15,000 English troops, armored knights, professional infantry, seasoned commanders. On the other, barely 6,000 Scots, poorly armed farmers, blacksmiths, and tradesmen led by a rebel with no royal blood. The odds are not just bad, they're laughable. English commanders John de Warenne and Hugh de Cressingham don't even take the fight seriously. To them, it's a formality, a cleanup. Another box checked in Edward's campaign to erase Scottish resistance. But Wallace has no interest in playing by their rules. Instead of charging into open battle, he climbs the high ground of Abbey Craig, positioning his forces above the narrow Stirling Bridge. For hours, he watches, waits, not with fear but with intent, because Wallace understands something that centuries of generals will one day write books about. Timing isn't everything. It's the only thing. As the English begin crossing the bridge, slowly, arrogantly, Wallace waits until exactly half their army is trapped between two banks. Then he strikes. The Scots descend from the hills like thunder war cries shaking the river valley. The English, split by the water, are paralyzed. Their heavy cavalry, the pride of Europe, can't maneuver. The bridge becomes a funnel of death. Horses scream. Soldiers drown. Knights are trampled by their own men. The slaughter is merciless. Cressingham, hated for his cruelty and greed, is cut down early. The Scots don't stop at death. They flay his body using his skin to make sword belts and scabbards. It's not just vengeance. It's a message. By sunset, what was supposed to be a quick suppression has become a catastrophe. The English army once thought invincible lies shattered. Wallace the outlaw from Renfrew has done the impossible. He hasn't just won a battle, he's rewritten the rules of war. In the days that follow, Wallace is no longer a fugitive. He's declared guardian of Scotland, effectively the ruler of a nation still breathing through broken ribs. For the first time in years, Scotland walks taller. Songs are sung, flags are raised, hope that dangerous thing is alive again. But Wallace knows better than to celebrate too long. Because he didn't just win, he humiliated a king. And kings don't forgive humiliation, especially not Edward Longshanks. Victory is a double-edged blade. It inspires the people, but it also awakens the wrath of kings. Edward Longshanks had been humiliated, and humiliation to a man like him is never forgiven. It is answered. By the summer of 1298, the English king returns to Britain, abandoning his campaigns in France and gathering a force unlike anything Wallace has faced. This isn't just an army, it's a reckoning. Seasoned knights, hardened infantry, and something else, thousands of Welsh longbowmen whose arrows can tear through armor from 200 yards. Wallace marches to meet them near the fields of Falkirk. He doesn't hesitate. He doesn't flinch. He knows what's coming, and he faces it anyway. His army is brave, but fractured. Many nobles refuse to fight under his command. Politics bleeds into the battlefield. What remains is a patchwork force, strong in spirit, but outmatched in arms. And yet Wallace prepares. He forms his men into schiltrons tight, circles of spearmen like living hedgehogs, their pikes bristling outward to hold the cavalry at bay. It works at first. The English knights crash against the walls of steel and fall. Horses scream. The line holds. But then the arrows come, wave after wave of long-range devastation. The Welsh archers, positioned with brutal precision, unleash a storm of iron that rains down from the sky. The schiltrons can defend against charging men, but not death from above. There is nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Scottish soldiers fall in droves, pierced, crushed, screaming. The line begins to buckle. Wallace watches it happen, helpless, enraged. And then it breaks. The English charge floods through the cracks like a dam exploding. The battlefield becomes a slaughterhouse. Wallace fights like a man possessed, cutting through wave after wave. But strategy cannot stop collapse. Valor cannot replace shields. He is forced to retreat, dragging what little remains of his army into the forests. Falkirk is more than a defeat. It's a shattering. Wallace resigns as guardian of Scotland. The same nobles who once praised him now turn away. He has no title, no army, no home. He becomes a shadow, a whisper, a name spoken in taverns and in dreams, but seen by no one. Some say he fled to France seeking help from the Pope or King Philip IV. Others say he wandered the highlands alone. What matters is this. For the first time since he drew his sword, Wallace fights with no one at his side. He is no longer leading a revolution. He is surviving one. For years, William Wallace became what the English feared most: a man without chains, without borders, without a fixed point to strike. A ghost. He moved through forests and villages, changing names, shifting with the wind. Every whisper of rebellion carried his shadow. Every fire lit in secret bore the echo of his name. To the people of Scotland, he was still their guardian. To the English, he was unfinished business. But even legends get tired. By 1305, Wallace was worn down physically and spiritually. His body, once a fortress of muscle and fire, was weakened from years of running, fighting, hiding. His heart carried more than wounds, it carried disillusion. Scotland had moved on. Nobles were cutting deals with the English crown. Robert the Bruce was hedging bets. The rebellion Wallace ignited now flickered in the hands of men who no longer believed in fire. And that's when betrayal struck, not from across the border, but from within. John de Menteith was a fellow Scot, a knight, someone Wallace may have once trusted. Maybe he offered promises of support. Maybe he offered intelligence, hope, and opening. But beneath the surface, he was already bought silver in his pockets, English favor on his tongue. He lured Wallace near Glasgow under the pretense of unity, of strategy. Instead, he offered him to the enemy. English soldiers swarmed from the trees like a net snapping shut. Wallace fought. Of course he fought, but he was alone, exhausted, and cornered. They chained him where he stood. That was the end of the chase. From that moment on, Wallace would never touch Scottish soil again as a free man. The journey to London was not swift. It was not quiet. It was calculated humiliation. Wallace was paraded through towns like a captured beast. He was bound, displayed in carts, spat upon by crowds. In each English village, children threw stones, Women cursed. Nobles watched from balconies, sipping wine, as the giant passed beneath them, stripped of everything but his silence. But still he never bowed, because Wallace understood something. Even now you can strip a man of his sword, his land, even his future. But if you cannot make him kneel, then you cannot truly conquer him. Edward had his body, but the war for Wallace's soul was still unfinished. And as the gates of London opened and the executioners prepared their ropes, the king believed he had finally won. But he didn't know the truth. He hadn't silenced a rebel. He had created a martyr. Edward could have hanged him, quickly, quietly. A clean execution, a forgotten footnote. But that was never the plan. William Wallace wasn't being punished. He was being erased. Westminster Hall, England's grandest seat of power, became the stage. Stone walls towered like judgment itself, carved with the symbols of conquest. It was here that Wallace, shackled and bloodied, stood before a court that had already decided his fate. The charges were hollow, but the sentence had weight. Treason, sacrilege, war crimes. But Wallace had never sworn allegiance to England, never bent the knee, never called Edward king, and when given the chance to speak, he delivered the words that would outlive every stone in that hall: "I cannot be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject." The verdict was thunderous. Not just death, but obliteration. He would be hanged until nearly dead, then drawn disemboweled alive, castrated organs burned, and finally quartered his body, hacked into pieces, and scattered across the land. This wasn't execution. This was a message carved in flesh. On the morning of August 23rd, 1305, London gathered to watch. Children sat on shoulders. Merchants closed their stalls. The air was heavy, not with reverence, but with bloodlust. Wallace was stripped naked, tied to a wooden hurdle, and dragged behind a horse through the filthy streets. The cobblestones tore his skin open in long, wet ribbons. Every bounce left bone exposed. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. He looked forward. They brought him to Smithfield, England's execution ground, where a scaffold stood waiting, draped in steel and smoke. The hanging came first. A thick rope tightened around his throat, pulling him just inches from the ground. Not enough to kill, only to torture. He dangled, convulsing face, purple eyes bulging. Just before death could claim him, they cut him down. Then the drawing began. The executioner sliced open his abdomen while he still breathed, reached inside, removed his stomach, his intestines, his manhood, burning each organ in front of the crowd. The fire popped and hissed as flesh met flame. Some turned away. Most watched. Then the final act. With sharp axes, they quartered him, limbs torn from torso, blood painting the platform. His head was severed, tarred, and placed atop London Bridge, the first head ever mounted there. The rest was sent home. One arm to Newcastle, one leg to Berwick, one to Stirling, one to Perth. The man who had once held Scotland together was now scattered to its edges, a gruesome warning nailed to the crossroads of rebellion. Edward believed it was over. He had silenced the voice, destroyed the flesh, burned the memory. But he had forgotten one thing. You can kill a man, but not what he stands for. They thought it was over. The crowd had scattered. The flames had died. Wallace's limbs, nailed to wooden posts across Scotland, rotted beneath grey skies and seagulls. His head, tarred and blackening, stared down from London Bridge, soulless, silent. And yet, something moved. Not in the body. That was gone. But in the people. Because Wallace didn't die in secret. He didn't vanish in the night. He was torn apart in daylight in front of thousands. Every scream, every slash, every organ tossed into fire was burned into memory. Edward had hoped it would crush resistance. Instead, it made him a martyr. Within months of Wallace's execution, something unimaginable happened. Robert the Bruce, once a cautious noble, once a man who had bowed to England, rose up. He killed his rival John Comyn in a church, took the crown of Scotland, declared war. And this time he wasn't fighting for land. He was fighting in Wallace's shadow, at Loudon Hill, at Bannockburn. Across forests and glens, Scottish warriors rode with a different fire in their eyes. They didn't just want to win, they wanted to finish what Wallace began. His name became a war cry, his memory a sword drawn in silence. Even Edward the King, who orchestrated Wallace's agony, never lived to see Scotland fall. He died 2 years later, consumed by illness and obsession. His final command: that his bones be boiled and carried at the head of every English army until Scotland was conquered. But it never was, and it never will be. Because in 1320, 15 years after Wallace's death, Scottish nobles gathered to sign the Declaration of Arbroath, one of the most defiant documents ever written. Its words ring like prophecy. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honors that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone which no honest man gives up, but with life itself. That sentence didn't come from a scribe or scholar. It came from Wallace's legacy, from the fire that refused to die. What England tried to erase had become unkillable. A man, a myth, a movement. Today, Wallace's bones are dust. The stakes he was nailed to have long since turned to ash, but his spirit remains. In every act of rebellion against tyranny, in every voice that says no to injustice, in every man or woman who chooses principle over fear. Because the body they quartered became a banner, and the silence they demanded became thunder. In the heart of modern-day London, traffic flows endlessly over Smithfield. Horns honk, shoes slap against concrete, tourists pass the memorial plaque without even noticing it. Few stop to read the name, fewer still remember what happened here. But history remembers. And more importantly, so do we. William Wallace died centuries ago. His flesh, once torn from his body, has long since returned to the soil. His bones were never buried. His heart was never given rest. But none of that matters, because immortality was never in his body. It was in his defiance. He didn't live long enough to see Scotland free. He didn't witness the rise of Robert the Bruce or the signing of the Declaration of Arbroath. He never saw the crown restored to Scottish hands or heard the word freedom shouted in open daylight without fear. But he caused it. That's the secret tyrants never understand. You can kill the man, you can silence his voice, burn his flesh, scatter his bones, but if he died for something greater than himself, you've done nothing but carve his name deeper into history's spine. Wallace didn't just resist England, he resisted erasure. And in doing so, he became something that empires cannot destroy, a symbol of what it means to stand tall when your legs are shaking, to speak truth when your voice is trembling, to fight for something you may never live to see. That kind of courage doesn't fade. It echoes. It echoed in America in 1776. It echoed in Berlin in 1989. It echoes wherever people choose principle over comfort, sacrifice over silence, fire over fear. William Wallace's life was brutal. His death was unspeakable. But his legacy. His legacy is everything England tried to prevent. A people awakened. A fire passed from hand to hand. A name that refuses to die. So, if you ever stand before injustice and wonder if your voice matters, if you ever face overwhelming power and ask, what can one person do, remember him. Remember the man who had nothing but his name, his sword, and his spine, and still brought an empire to its knees. They dragged his body through the streets, thinking they were ending a rebellion, but what they did was ignite a revolution. And that revolution lives on in every act of courage, every refusal to kneel, every whisper that becomes a roar. Because some men don't die when their hearts stop. They die when they are forgotten. And William Wallace will never be forgotten. If this story moved you, if the legacy of William Wallace reminded you that courage still matters, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Every click helps us bring powerful, forgotten histories back to life. Share this video with someone who still believes in standing for something greater than themselves. Subscribe for more stories that don't just teach history but make you feel it. And drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Together, we keep these voices alive. Together, we remember what others tried to erase. Thank you for being here.